So far, the Europeans have been doing pretty well for the most part. And then, unfortunately, they have a time period that just isn't the greatest for them at all. It is called a time of crisis. It's called this because it was truly believed that this was the time of the apocalypse. They really felt, and again, remember, they were very, very religious people at this time. And so they really felt that the four horsemen of the apocalypse had shown up, that they had demonstrated themselves to the world at this point. So the end of the world was near, that the end of times was coming. And the four horsemen is this Christian belief in the book of Revelations that the end of the world will be signaled by the coming of four things: famine, disease, war, and death. And that these four things are represented by the four horsemen, and these four horsemen would make an appearance on earth that would signal the end of the world. And by the mid 1300s, it seemed like the end was near because of what was happening in Europe at this time. Basically, you had the outbreak of the Black Death, and the Black Death is the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague is a disease that is spread by fleas. And basically, the fleas got it from the rats, and the rats were spreading it throughout Europe because the rats were on ships and they could go anywhere. They were on the trade routes, and so you see a lot of outbreaks of the bubonic plague on the trade routes. Anywhere that ships dock, there's going to be a large outbreak of the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague had broken out many times before this, but it had always died down fairly quickly. The problem with it this time is that this strain survives and it mutates, and it basically runs rampant throughout Europe. Very few people had any sort of immunity to it. It is a very fast disease. In fact, you're only sick for 2 or 3 days before you die. So it moves very, very quickly at destroying your system. Very few survived. Most people do not. If you survived, you were then immune to it. So that was kind of good because you're not going to get it again. But you're most likely physically scarred, and people are going to shun you because they think they could still get it from you. The contributing factor for why this disease spreads so quickly and to so many is because of the unsanitary conditions in the towns and the homes at the time. Remember, we talked about city life and how the houses were so close together, and that waste was thrown into the streets and people tromped through it. And so just the conditions led to the rise of having rats in your neighborhood, and that would lead to the fleas on the rats that would then infect you. So the symptoms of the bubonic plague, it attacks your buboes, which is basically your lymph nodes, and your glands for your lymph nodes are in your armpits, in your neck, and in your groin region. And so the virus would get in there, and it causes it to inflame, which means it's going to cause it to swell. So you would have these huge bulges in your neck and your armpits and your groin, and eventually it would burst blood vessels. And so just like when you get a bruise, you have a burst blood vessel underneath it. That's what gives you the blackness of your bruise. That's what would happen in your lymph nodes, is that they would also burst blood vessels and they would turn black. And so you would have like black bulbs on your neck and in your armpits and your groin. And so you run a very high fever as a result, and you break out into sweats, and you're coughing, and eventually you're spitting up blood. Basically your body deteriorates from the inside, so you stink because your body is dissolving, I guess. It's a very horrible death, because after the lymph nodes, it then goes after your internal organs, and they basically become this slush pit. They disintegrate, and not a pleasant way to die at all. Very, very horrible. But anyway, the Black Death is going to lead to some social upheaval in the Middle Ages. There was no way for them to stop it. They didn't understand how it was being spread. They didn't understand the concept of germs and diseases, of viruses, of preventative measures that could be taken, that was totally beyond their realm of understanding. They just didn't get it. They didn't know. And so people are going to turn to magic and witchcraft because for some of them Christianity wasn't working, so they're looking at other options. They're trying to find anything. Others are going to blame the Jews and say that it's their fault that this is happening. And so many Jewish populations, their villages are going to be completely slaughtered for this totally untruthful belief that they were the ones who were causing it. Others are going to say, well, we're going to die anyway, might as well have a good time before we go. And so they plunge into wild pleasures, and they go out carousing and have drinking and gambling and sleeping around and all kinds of stuff. Others felt that this was God's punishment on them for not being a good enough Christian, and so they become very repentant, and some of them take it to a huge extreme that they will go from town to town reciting Bible passages or the Psalms, and they'll whip themselves. They'll have these whips that with little bits of metal on the end that they whip themselves with, and they're called flagellants because they're using this flagell, which is a whip, to whip themselves and show that they are repentant, that they are sorry for whatever they did that would cause this Black Plague. Anyway, so the bubonic plague actually leads to some economic results as well, because it kind of dies away, but it doesn't completely die away. There will be outbreaks or recurrences of the bubonic plague throughout all of the 1300s. So throughout a 100-year period, it's going to come back, not always as big as it was in like the 1320s, but and 1340s, but it still comes back, just little pieces of it. But as a result, so many people die that production declines, and when you don't have as much product, the prices for what you do have tend to soar, so then people can't afford it. It takes Europe about 100 years to recover from the Black Death, recover their population, recover economically, recover politically, all kinds of stuff. It has a huge, huge impact. So the Black Death is representative of one of the four horsemen. There's your disease. Another indication that the end was near was the 100 Years' War. And this is a war that takes place between England and France. Now, they'd had wars before this, and they will have wars after this as well. But this war is going to last for a very long time. And it's fought from 1337 to 1453, which is actually more than 100 years. But according to the way they kept track of time back then, they kept track of generations. And so it was roughly 5 generations, which a generation is about 20 to 25 years. And so 5 generations long would be 100 years. So that's why it's called the 100 Years' War. So how did this 100 Years' War start? Well, it started in 1337. Edward III of England claimed the French crown. He says, I deserve to be the French king. I have ties to France, and the French have a problem with that, and so a war erupts. The English in the beginning have a lot of victories. They actually are doing very, very well. In fact, it looks like they're going to win France for a long time, and their success is due to the fact that the English developed the longbow, and a longbow is a 6-foot-long weapon, well, roughly 6-foot-long weapon, and the longbow had some advantages over a regular hunting bow. It had a longer range, so you could fire from further away and still do damage. It could shoot up to 3 arrows at a time, so now you've got multiple arrows being shot at the same time. And because it was such a large weapon, it had a lot of force behind it, and the force is going to be able to allow those arrows to pierce even armor, and with the exception of like the heaviest armor it couldn't get through, but it was able to get through armor, which means that it's going to be an advantage against the knights. Well, all of these victories that the English were having as a result of this new weapon is going to take a toll on the French morale. They are going to basically wonder, okay, can we make it through this? And eventually we get a French miracle, and the French miracle is in a young girl named Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a 17-year-old peasant woman. She's not even from the upper classes. She's uneducated. She's illiterate. She up until the time that she becomes kind of a national figure, she was working on the farm. Nobody had heard of her before. But she eventually is going to appear before Charles VII, who was the uncrowned king of France. And she is going to appear to Charles and say that God had sent her to save France, that God had appeared to her in visions and had told her that she was the one to lead Charles to the throne. And so she is going to convince Charles to let her lead his army. Basically, Charles was at the end of his rope and felt might as well, and nothing else was working up to this point, so sure, why not? So he lets her go, and within 1 year, she leads the French troops to victory after victory after victory. So she's very, very successful. Well, because of her success, she's going to become a target. The English want her, and they want her bad because they want to get her out of French hands so that she can't lead them into victory after victory after victory. And so she will eventually be captured by allies of the English, and the English are going to haul her back to England, and they put her on trial for witchcraft because they said there's no way God spoke to you, because he wouldn't tell you that Charles deserves to be king of France. That's Edward III who deserves to be king of France, and blah blah blah, or whoever was king at that time, because Edward was dead by then. But they said, no, you're making it up. You're a witch. You've been consorting with demons and stuff. Throughout the entire trial, Joan remained convinced that, or stuck to her story that God spoke to her. And she will be convicted anyway, and she is burned at the stake. For her, that makes her a martyr. She died for her faith. And France is going to see her as a martyr right away. And in fact, it will become sort of a rallying cry for the French that Joan died for us, that Joan was God's voice piece, and she died for us. Later on, the church is going to have her declared a saint too, but it takes a while. It's not an immediate thing. The outcome is that after Joan's death, France kind of goes on the offensive. Instead of waiting for the French to attack, or for the English to attack them, they take it to the English. And it helps that France also develops a new weapon themselves. It's called the cannon. And so they will use the cannon, which projects a large metal ball at castle walls, and they will use it to attack castles that the English had taken over. So they're actually destroying their own castles, but it was castles that the English had taken over and had control of. And so the English are going to be forced to retreat. And so it is a combination of cannons as well as the French spirit that we need to avenge Joan of Arc. And so, like I said, there's your second horsemen. You have war. So we had death, and we had we have three horsemen. We have death, we have war, and we have famine, or not famine, we have disease. So where does famine come in? Well, famine came in with the Black Death and with the 100 Years' War, because you had soldiers going off to fight who are no longer farming, and you had soldiers who were dying because of the bubonic plague who were no longer farming. And so that causes a lack of food. So now there's no food, and that's your famine. So you actually had all four aspects of the four horsemen of the apocalypse in this later Middle Ages time. Well, as we can see, there's going to be different paths for the French and the English as a result of all of this. The French are going to achieve some sort of national unity. The kings expand their power. They're going to have a lot of influence as well. England is going to rely a lot on its parliament, and we're going to see the growth of parliament's power in the next few units as well. So they kind of diverge. In France, we'll see more monarch or more power with the kings, and in England, we're going to see more power going to parliament, being more representative of the people.